Boldwood presents Revenge, written by Kerry Kaya and read by Annie Aldington. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. It was the heat that Max Hardcastle registered first. A burning, blistering heat that left him with no other choice than to retreat several paces back. And then the smoke, so thick, black and acrid, that he could actually taste the charred debris in the back of his throat. His chest wheezed, his lungs screamed out for oxygen, and slamming his hand over his mouth and nose, Max turned his face away from not only the searing heat, but from what had also once been his car showroom. Everything was gone. The cars, the office, his livelihood. Even the iron railings surrounding the property were blackened and buckled. In the distance, he could hear the familiar wail of sirens, and he hurriedly took out his mobile phone. Locating the messaging service, he pressed play and brought the device up to his ear. He hadn't recognised the caller's voice, nor did he know how the culprit responsible for burning down his business had gained access to his personal telephone number. Max listened to the recorded message again. A part of him had believed the threat to be nothing other than idle, until he'd seen the billowing smoke high above the rooftops as he'd sped towards the showroom. It was in that instant he'd known his business was gone, and that just as the assailant had warned, there wouldn't be an inch of the forecourt left unscathed. Anger began to build inside of him, and as two fire engines screeched to a halt just feet away from where he was standing, there were only two questions on Max's mind. Who was responsible? And what could he have possibly done to make himself a target? At her home in Dagenham, Essex, Tracey Tempest climbed out of the bath, and wrapping a large white fluffy towel around herself, she padded out of the bathroom and into her bedroom. Hanging on the outside of the wardrobe door was one of her favourite outfits, a cream linen shift dress that she would accessorise with a leopard print chiffon scarf draped loosely around her slender neck. She had a particular penchant for leopard print, and to finish off the outfit, she had placed her trademark leopard print heels on the floor beside the wardrobe. Despite the excitement that coursed through her veins for the briefest of moments, Tracey faltered. Had she done the right thing by agreeing to a fourth date with Max Hardcastle? Not so long ago, Tracey would have balked at the notion of even looking at another man, let alone actually enjoying dates with someone other than her husband. And yet here she was doing just that. Her husband, Terry, was gone, murdered by his business partner, Kenny Kempton, and she was in the throes of a budding romance with one of Terry's oldest and closest friends, Max Hardcastle. For months, Tracey had classed Max as a friend, a good friend. They got on well and enjoyed spending time in one another's company. And in the grand scheme of things, that was all that mattered, wasn't it? At the end of the day, Max made her feel happy, an emotion she could never have envisaged for herself after Terry had been brutally gunned down at his own birthday party. Still to this day she could hear her screams. They had been animalistic, so raw was her grief. In the aftermath of the shooting, her desperate attempts to keep her husband's heart beating had proven to be futile, and as Terry had taken his last breaths, Tracey had cradled him in her arms, begging him not to leave her. The injury he'd sustained had been too great, and the bullet had torn through his upper back, obliterating flesh, muscle, and vital organs in its wake. Her mind wandered to her two sons, Ricky and Jamie. Would they be happy for her, she wondered, or could her and Max's relationship potentially tear her family apart? And, more to the point, was she prepared to take the risk? Her sons meant the world to her, and even though they were adults now, she would still lay her life on the line for them, as any good mother would. It wasn't as though she had actively sought Max out, and her sons were bound to understand this. They knew her well enough to know that she had been devoted to their father. Her boys also knew that when she'd first met Max, she had despised him on sight, and that she'd even accused him of having a hand in her husband's murder. But she couldn't have been more wrong, and the false accusation she'd made still caused her cheeks to flush with shame. Max had only ever been a true friend to Terry, and he had been there without question for both her and her sons after Terry's murder. And no matter how much she had tried to resist Max's charms, she couldn't help but feel drawn to him. He had a certain something about him. Not only was Max a handsome man, but he also had high morals. It was just one of the many traits that they shared. He was strong, yet fair, and he didn't take fools gladly. Above all else, Tracey felt safe around him, and more importantly, she trusted him too. And after being married to a man who had lied to her throughout their entire marriage, Tracey was determined that going forward she wouldn't settle for anything less than honesty. And perhaps that was where the problem lay. As much as her boys liked, trusted, and respected Max, they had adored their father. Growing up, both Ricky and Jamie had looked up to Terry, and after his death, they were still finding it difficult to come to terms with the fact that their dad hadn't been the man he'd portrayed himself to be. No. In reality, her husband had been a liar, a cheat, a bully, and even worse than that, he had forced women into prostitution, something she and her boys could never forgive him for. An hour later, Tracey had applied her makeup, dried her hair, sprayed just the right amount of perfume behind her ears and across her wrists, then dressed. Slipping on her heels, she took a quick glance at her watch. It was almost time to leave, and the familiar sense of butterflies began to flutter within her tummy. As much as she chastised herself, Tracey couldn't help but laugh out loud. She should know better at her age. After all, she was a grown woman fast approaching her 50th birthday, not a schoolgirl longing after her first crush. Collecting her handbag, Tracey paused. Terry's car key still hung on a brass hook beside the front door. It wasn't often that she drove her late husband's car, yet there was something about the Audi that she loved. It was the power, she supposed. Not to mention, there was no denying that it was a beautiful car. The gunmetal grey paintwork sleek and shiny. It was the kind of car that was guaranteed to turn heads, something that had once embarrassed Tracey. But now she embraced the car's elegance and luxurious interior, and didn't blame those who gave the car a second glance. A smile drifted across Tracey's face, and snatching the car key off the hook, she clasped it tight in her fist. Bugger it, she decided. Terry had no need for the Audi. It wasn't as though he was going to miraculously rise from the dead, was it? So she may as well make full use of the car. Where was the point in leaving something so beautiful to rot and turn to rust on the drive? Tracey stepped outside the house, and as she made her way towards the car, her mobile phone began to ring. On seeing Max's name flash up on the screen, Tracey beamed. But as Max spoke, Tracey's grin froze, and with the phone cradled between her ear and shoulder, she unlocked the car. "I'm on my way," she told him, before ending the call and flinging both her handbag and mobile phone onto the passenger seat. As she drove towards Southend-on-Sea, concern was at the forefront of Tracey's mind. Had the burning of the car showroom simply been an accident, or was there something more sinister at hand? As soon as the thought popped into her mind, her forehead furrowed and she shook her head. Why on earth would someone have deliberately set the car dealership alight? The very notion seemed ludicrous to her. Admittedly, Max was no angel. After all, he'd served 2 prison sentences, the first for murder and the second for ABH. But he'd put the past behind him, and in recent years had turned his life around. Fair enough. 1 or 2 of the cars that he'd sold on to private buyers in the past may not have exactly been kosher, as her son so eloquently put it. But as of now, the cars on the forecourt were legitimate. Or at least, this was what Max and the boys had reassured her whenever she'd inquired as to where the cars had come from. A heavy sense of foreboding slid through Tracey's veins. and pushing her foot down on the accelerator, she could only hope and pray that the damage to the car showroom wasn't as bad as Max had first indicated. And even more than that, she hoped that there was an innocent explanation for the fire. Perhaps faulty wiring, or maybe even a kid's prank gone wrong. The alternative was too much for her to even think about, and the last thing any of them needed was to be embroiled in yet another active feud, one that could potentially put everyone she cared about at risk. Chapter 2. By the time Tracey pulled up outside the car showroom 40 minutes later, the fire had all but been contained. Only the deep orange glow from small dotted burning heaps remained, as wisps of white smoke drifted up from both the charred remains of the burnt-out cars and what had once been the office. Tracey climbed out of the Audi, and slamming her hand over her mouth, she took a sharp intake of breath, her eyes wide and horror-stricken. The damage was so much worse than she could have ever imagined, and from where she was standing, it was more than obvious that there was nothing salvageable, at least nothing of any value anyway. Even the portable cabin that served as an office had burnt down to its foundations. As far as she could tell, everything that Max had worked so hard to build had been destroyed. Her gaze searched him out. Broad-shouldered and standing at over 6 feet, he wasn't exactly hard to miss. With his back turned away from her, she took a moment to study him. The car showroom had been Max's pride and joy, and despite owning a number of bookmakers, he spent most of his day at the car lot, preferring to leave the running of the betting shops to her sons. As if sensing her presence, Max turned around, and making eye contact, he gave a helpless shrug. The look on Max's face was almost enough to break Tracey's heart, and as she walked into his arms, she held him to her, tight. "I don't understand," she choked out. "How could this have happened?" Max gave a second shrug, and stalling for time, he turned back to look at the damage. "I don't know, darling," he finally answered. He shot a surreptitious glance towards the attending fire crew and police officers, and raised his voice slightly. "Maybe one of the cars had a fault. I mean, you do hear about these things happening, don't you? A car spontaneously bursting into flames, or even the manufacturer recalling a series of cars. It happens all the time." Tracey narrowed her eyes. She may have been green around the edges, but she was no fool, and as such wouldn't be treated like one. Fair enough. She was no expert, but even she could see that the fire hadn't been started by a problem with one of the cars. The damage was too extensive for a start. She opened her mouth to answer, when out of the corner of her eye she spotted her eldest son's car approaching, which not only forced her to snap her lips closed, but also to reluctantly step out of Max's arms. "Fuck me!" Jamie Tempest exclaimed, as he jumped out of his elder brother's car and brought his hands up to his head. "How did this happen?" Max shook his head, and slipping his mobile phone back into his pocket, he crossed his arms over his chest. "Like I was just saying to your mum," he said, nodding towards Tracey. "There must have been a fault with one of the cars." Tracey's eldest son Ricky narrowed his eyes and turned to look at his mother, a puzzled expression sweeping over his face. "Mum?" he asked. "What are you doing here?" A sliver of fear ran down the length of Tracey's spine. This wasn't exactly how she'd intended for her sons to find out about her relationship with Max. No, if she and Max had any kind of future together, then she wanted to sit her boys down and then break the news to them as gently as she could. "What do you think I'm doing here?" she snapped back. "Max called me about the fire and I came over straight away." Tracey's cheeks were flushed pink. She was sure that her son would see straight through her lies. Satisfied with his mother's answer, Ricky turned back to assess the damage, oblivious to the knowing look that Tracey and Max shared. "And you reckon all of this was caused by a fault with one of the cars?" As he jerked his head towards the forecourt, Jamie's voice held a note of suspicion. Max raised his eyebrows and indicated to the fire crew, and in particular the police officers. "What other explanation could there be?" Taking the hint on board, Jamie nodded. He was astute enough to know when to keep stum, and seeing as the old Bill were crawling all over the place, now was as good a time as any to keep his mouth firmly shut. Well, inhaling a deep breath, Tracey gave a stilted smile and gestured towards the damage. It's a small consolation, I know, but at least everything is insured. An awkward silence fell. She looked between her two sons and Max, and her heart sank down to the pit of her stomach. Please tell me that there is insurance. Max lifted his eyebrows and sighed. Some, he mumbled with a glance towards where the office had once been situated. Following his gaze, Tracey closed her eyes in distress. What do you mean by some? She asked through gritted teeth. The office and a few of the cars, Max admitted. A few? Tracey's eyes flew open and she placed her hand upon her chest. How many cars exactly are we talking about? Does it matter, Mum? Jamie implored. It's not going to change anything, is it? Of course it matters, Tracey spat. How many cars are insured? Max averted his gaze. 10. He swallowed deeply, then gave a small shrug. Maybe 8. I can't remember the exact number. Tracey's jaw dropped. 8, she cried. But... She turned to look at the burnt-out wreckages. Disbelief etched across her face. There must have been at least 15 cars here. Glancing towards Ricky and Jamie, Max rubbed at the nape of his neck. The action wasn't lost on Tracey. If anything, all it served to do was prove that he was guilty of lying to her, that the cars weren't being sold legally. Oh, I see, Tracey retorted. I should have seen this coming, considering your track record, she spat. The rest weren't legal, were they? Keep your voice down, Max hissed, indicating to a uniformed police officer standing just several feet away from them. Incensed, Tracey motioned towards what was left of the car lot. And I suppose you expect me to believe that all of this was caused by a fault? That it was an accident? Do I actually look that stupid? She growled. What is this? Some kind of insurance scam? Jamie rolled his eyes. The cars would have had to have been insured in the first place for it to be a scam, Mum, he mumbled. Snapping her gaze towards her youngest son, Tracey glowered. Well, come on, she demanded. Fill me in on all the gory details. Digging his hand into his pocket, Max pulled out the keys to his apartment. We'll talk about this later, he said, his voice low as he slipped a spare key off the keyring, then held out the bunch of keys. Just go to my place and wait for me there. All of you, he added, as an afterthought, as he turned to look at the two brothers. You can bet your life we will talk about this. Tracey bristled as she snatched the keys out of Max's hand. And believe me, she said over her shoulder, as she stormed back towards the Audi, you've got some explaining to do. And that includes the both of you too, she said, glaring at her sons. To say that Tracey was livid would be an understatement, and as she stalked the length of Max's lounge, she pursed her lips together. So much for honesty, she thought to herself. Her and Max were only 4 dates into their relationship, and already he'd been lying to her. Did you know about the cars being stolen? She demanded of her sons. The cars weren't stolen, Jamie sighed. They just weren't put through the books. Oh, so that makes it all right then, Tracey cried, throwing her arms up into the air. Knocking the taxman is just as illegal, you know. Ricky rubbed at his temples. It's not a big deal, Mum, he said, giving a nonchalant shrug. Everyone does it. Not a big deal, Tracey rounded on her eldest son. This was meant to be a fresh start for us. She swallowed deeply as memories of her husband's betrayal sprang to her mind. Terry had dealt with stolen goods before moving on to pimping out innocent women. Was that the road Max and her sons were headed down? Was history about to repeat itself? She gave an involuntary shiver. Over her dead body would she allow her boys to take the same path that their father had walked? It was bad enough they were carbon copies of her husband. Every time she looked at her sons' handsome faces, it was as if she were looking at Terry himself, as though he were mocking her naivety and her stupidness from beyond the grave. And she had been naive when it came to her husband. Terry could have told her the sky was pink and purple and she would have believed him. Perhaps she should have seen it coming. After all, Ricky and Jamie were Tempests through and through, and they had more of their father in them than she cared to admit. And as for Max, it was no secret that he'd once served time for killing someone. Handed down a life sentence as a teenager, he was still on licence and could be recalled back to prison the very moment he put a foot wrong. The burning question was, would he drag her sons down with him? "Mum, for fuck's sake," Jamie remarked. "Will you just chill out? It's like Ricky said, it's not a big deal. Dad was selling stolen cars for years, and it never did him any harm, did it? The old Bill were clueless, and it's not like the cars were even knocked off. Max just didn't declare them, that's all. It's no biggie, and it's hardly something the filth would be interested in." Tracey's heart began to pump faster. "Don't," she warned, pointing a stiff finger towards her youngest son. "Try to treat me like I'm a bloody fool. And as for your father—" She snapped her lips closed, not wanting to say the words out loud. Terry's deceit and subsequent death was still too raw for both her and her sons to even think about, let alone comprehend. "As for Dad, what?" Jamie growled, his back instantly up at the mention of his father. Coming to a halt, Tracey glanced anxiously at her watch. "Where the hell is Max?" she asked, in an attempt to change the subject. 3 hours they'd been waiting for the man in question to return home. A cold chill crept down her spine. Could the police have had their suspicions that the cars hadn't been declared and hauled him into the police station for questioning? Maybe he'd been charged with trying to evade the tax man and was already on his way back to prison. "Answer the question, Mum," Jamie said, a steely glint in his blue eyes. Tracey turned to look at her youngest son, and seeing the hurt spread across his face, she sighed. "Nothing. It doesn't matter." Jamie was about to protest, when Ricky gave a slight shake of his head. "Leave it, bruv," he said. "Yeah, but—" "I said, leave it," Ricky growled. He took out his mobile phone and noted the time. "Mum's right. Max should have been back hours ago." Tracey opened her mouth to agree, when the sound of a key turning in a lock, followed by the front door gently closing, made all three of them turn expectantly towards the lounge door. Moments later, Max strode into the room, his strides long and his face set like thunder. Not only did a layer of dark stubble cover Max's clenched jaw, but he also looked tired, Tracey noted, if the subtle hint of dark shadows underneath his eyes was anything to go by. Not that she felt much sympathy for him at this precise moment in time. No, she was so angry with both him and her sons that she could practically taste her fury. Getting up from the sofa, Ricky spread open his arms. "What the fuck is going on? You know as well as I do that the fire was no accident. Someone torched the gaff and did a pretty good job of it while they were at it. There's fuck all left. At least nothing that can be saved." Without saying a word, Max threw the spare key onto the coffee table, then took out his mobile phone. Pressing play on the recorded message, he stared down at the device as though the answers he so desperately craved would suddenly become clear to him, as though the more he listened to the recording, the sooner the identity of the caller would become apparent. Tracey, Ricky and Jamie inched closer, and as the caller began to speak, they craned their necks to listen. "What is this?" Tracey gasped, once the recording had finished playing. "Play it again," Ricky interrupted. Max pressed play a second time, and once again the caller's voice filtered into the air. The threat was clear for them all to hear, despite the fact the culprit had gone to great lengths to disguise his voice. "Does anyone recognise the bastard?" Max asked. All three of them shook their heads. "It's too muffled," Jamie remarked, as he rubbed at his chin. Sighing, Max nodded in defeat. "Why would someone have done this?" Tracey's anger was quickly replaced by fear. The caller hadn't only made a threat, but he had actually followed through and decimated the car lot. "This isn't a lone wolf," Ricky said with a shake of his head. "To have done that much damage to the showroom. There must have been more than one culprit. My guess is Dixon," Ricky said, turning to look at Max. "You're his closest competition, and knowing that sly fucker, he'd do anything to wipe out the business. It makes sense. With you out of the equation, there isn't another car dealership around here for miles." Max's face contorted with anger. From the very moment he'd received the threat, Dickie Dixon had been one of the first names conjured up in his mind too. They'd had more than one run-in over the years, and some of those run-ins had turned pretty ugly. Not that Max considered his business to be an actual threat to Dixon, considering Dickie only dealt with what Max would class as second-hand runarounds, the majority of which would be better off in a scrapyard rather than on the road. Tracey's eyes widened, and placing a hand on her chest, she nodded towards the mobile phone. "He didn't just specify the car lot. He said that he had plans to destroy you and everything you hold dear." Max looked down at the phone again, his forehead furrowing. "Oh, fuck!" Ricky exclaimed. "You know what that means, don't you?" "No," Tracey answered, with a bewildered shake of her head. "The bookies. Think about it," he said, pointing to his temple. "He's going to go after the betting shops next." His expression hardening, Max snatched back the spare key from the coffee table, then headed for the front door with Tracey, Ricky and Jamie hot on his heels. "I'm going to kill him," he roared. "And believe me, when I get my hands on the no-good bastard, I will destroy him over this." 10 minutes later, Max brought his car to a skidding halt outside the larger of the bookmakers he owned in Leigh-on-Sea, Essex, just a short 5-minute drive away from the car lot. Throwing open the car door, Max jumped out. He let out a breath and dragged a hand across his clammy forehead. Much to his relief, there was no telltale smoke billowing from the metal grilles that secured the premises, nor any visible signs of a break-in. He glanced towards the pub on the corner of the street. The throng of patrons spilling out onto the pavement was something comforting. Surely no one would be stupid enough to attempt to burn the property down when they could be clearly seen and perhaps even identified. "I'll check around the back," Ricky volunteered. "Yeah, I'll come with you," Jamie said, as he shoved his hands into his pockets and made after his brother. Max watched them go, his steely gaze travelling the length of the parade of shops, on the lookout for anything out of the ordinary. Were they being watched? Were the culprits getting a kick out of seeing his panic firsthand? He ran his tongue over his teeth, more than aware that they'd played right into the bastards' hands and were giving them exactly what they wanted. But what was the alternative, Max mused? To sit back and wait for everything he owned to be destroyed? No, Max wasn't made that way. He'd never been in the habit of allowing someone to get the better of him in the past, and he sure as hell didn't intend to start now. Moments later, the two brothers returned. "Well," Max called out to them, "did you find anything?" "Nah, nothing," Ricky shrugged, "and from what I can make out, it doesn't look as though anything's been tampered with either." Chewing on the inside of his cheek, Max nodded. It was exactly as he'd suspected. The caller had chosen his words carefully, and as a result, sent them on a wild goose chase, or at least, this was what Max hoped anyway. "So what do we do now?" Tracey asked, as she looked between her sons and Max. Taking one final look around him, Max nodded towards where they'd parked the cars. "Go back to my place," he said, pulling out his car keys. "I'll be back soon." "What do you mean?" Tracey asked, her eyes widening. "Where are you going?" "It doesn't matter," Max answered, as he ushered Tracey towards her car. "Like I said, I won't be long." "Do you want us to come with you?" Ricky said, jerking his head towards Jamie. Max looked the brothers over. He had to admit the added muscle could come in handy, especially if he had a welcoming committee waiting for him. Not that he actually needed them, or anyone else for that matter, to fight his battles. He was more than capable of taking care of himself, a fact that they were all well aware of. "Yeah," he nodded. "You might as well come along for the ride." "No!" Tracey gasped, her skin turning ashen as she watched helplessly as her sons climbed into Max's car. "You're going after Dixon, aren't you?" she cried. Without answering the question, Max bundled Tracey into the Audi. "Just go back to my place and wait for us there." About to protest, Tracey made to climb out of the car before Max pushed her gently back inside. "Tracey," he said, his voice brooking no arguments, "for once in your life, will you just do as you're told without arguing? Go back to my place and wait for us. Like I said, we won't be long." "But "No buts," Max growled over his shoulder as he stormed back to his car. "And make sure that you lock the front door behind you." By the time Max pulled into the car park of the Jolly Cricketers pub, situated on the A127 near Basildon, Essex, his anger was so tangible that he was all but ready to commit murder. "How do you even know that Dixon was behind the arson attack?" Jamie asked, as he looked up from his mobile phone to peer out of the car windscreen. "It could have been just about anyone." "There's no one else it could be," Max answered, as he surveyed Dickie Dixon's red Jaguar that was parked just feet away from them. "From day one, this bastard has done nothing but cause me grief. He would have got a kick out of this. He's warped in the head." Jamie didn't look so sure, and as his forehead furrowed, he glanced towards his brother. "Yeah, but—" Ricky rolled his eyes. "Keep up, bruv," he said, gesturing towards the mobile phone, that as of late appeared to be glued to his brother's hand. "Dixon owns a car dealership just up the road from Max's." "Yeah? And?" Jamie frowned even further. Fair enough. He could see where Ricky and Max were coming from. It was no secret that Dickie Dixon was a major pain in the arse, the type of man who was more often than not tolerated rather than well-liked and respected. But despite his flaws, he was still a face in his own right, albeit on a lower level than, say, Max, for example. It would also be fair to say that Dickie went out of his way to cause ructions, and one of his favourite pastimes was to belittle those around him. But to commit arson? Nah, Jamie just couldn't see it. For a start, Dixon wouldn't have the bottle. He was all mouth and no trousers. Everyone knew that. And that went for his two sons as well. Barry and Mark Dixon might walk around as though they owned the town, but their arseholes soon started flapping the minute someone stood up to them, and Jamie knew that for a fact. Just a few months earlier, he and Ricky had got into an altercation with the Dixon brothers, and the Dixons had soon backtracked on their threats, once they'd realised exactly who they were dealing with. "Who is Dixon's main competitor?" Ricky continued, fast on his way to losing patience with his younger brother. He waited a few moments for his question to sink in, then jerked his head towards Max. "With Max out of the way," he said, spreading open his arms, "Dixon's shitty little car lot is the only dealership around here for... I don't know." He shrugged and looked across to Max for confirmation. "It's got to be at least 2 or 3 miles, hasn't it?" 3, Max confirmed. "There you go. 3 miles. So it stands to reason that Dixon would be high up on the list of suspects. He's got the most to gain from Max being out of business." "Yeah, I suppose so," Jamie conceded, still somewhat unconvinced as they climbed out of the car and made their way towards the pub. Before they'd even stepped 2 feet inside the public bar, the sound of Dickie Dixon's laughter filled the air. It was a distinctive laugh, resembling that of a hyena, the kind of laugh that grated heavily on Max's nerves, and was more than a good enough reason for him to smash his fist into Dixon's face. Not that he actually needed a valid excuse. There was enough bad blood between the two men to warrant a kicking of sorts. As they followed the sound, soon enough, the man himself came into view. Surrounded by his cronies, Dickie Dixon was standing at the bar. He was in his late 50s and had a slim build and ferret-like features. His once dark blonde hair that was peppered with grey was stained with nicotine, giving it more of a dirty yellow appearance, and his cheeks and hooked nose were riddled with tiny red thread veins that brought further testament to the fact that he was a creature of habit, and that he liked to prop up the bar on a nightly basis. He was decked out in grey trousers that had been washed and pressed so often they looked greasy, and a white cotton shirt. A heavy gold signet ring glistened on his pinky finger, as he lifted an ever-present cigarette up to his thin lips. Max charged forward, and before Dickie could even comprehend what was about to go down, Max had slammed him into a wooden pillar with so much force that the cigarette Dickie had been holding slipped from his fingers, scattering burning embers and ash across the front of his shirt. "You no good snidey cunt!" Max roared. One hand wrapped around Dickie's throat, the other clenched into a tight fist. "My business!" he spat into Dickie's face, spraying him his spittle as he did so. "Everything is gone! The whole fucking shebang wiped out! All because of you!" Dickie blinked rapidly. A mixture of both confusion and shock etched across his face. "What business?" he managed to splutter out, his cheeks turning even redder as his startled gaze darted around him in the hope for some backup, preferably in the form of his two sons. "I don't know anything about your business, you mad fucker! Why the fuck would I?" A craftiness settled in his eyes. To see Hardcastle looking so rattled was the equivalent of all his Christmases coming at once. "More's the fucking pity, because there is nothing I would love more than to see you brought down." It was the exact answer Max had been anticipating. For all his faults, even Dickie wasn't foolish enough to admit to having first-hand knowledge regarding the arson attack. Pulling back his fist, Max threw the first in a series of punches, and as blood exploded from the older man's nose, Dickie gave a loud whelp and brought his hands up to his face. "My nose!" he shrieked, spitting out the blood that trickled into his mouth. "You broke my fucking nose!" Anger creased Max's face. Once he'd finished with him, a broken nose would be the least of Dickie's problems. "I'm going to destroy you over this," he seethed. "And believe me, this day has been a long time coming. You and that big trap of yours have finally gone too far." Beginning to throw punch after punch, he was oblivious to the startled screams around him. "I know it was you!" he spat between each ferocious jab. "You did this!" Underneath the blows that rained down upon him, Dickie dropped unceremoniously to the floor, and curling himself into a fetal position, he placed his arms protectively over his head. His face was bloody, and already beginning to swell from the brutal assault. Max lifted his foot, ready to deliver a sickening kick to Dickie's head, when Ricky pulled back on Max's arm, forcing him to a halt. "It wasn't him, mate." He gestured down at Dickie's semi-conscious form, then leaned in closer to speak privately in Max's ear. "If it was him, he would have at least smirked or done something to give the game away. You know what a slimy little fucker he is. He would have got a kick out of this." He shook his head, his eyes silently warning Max to step away before he could cause any more damage, or maybe even go that one step further and kill Dixon in a pub full of witnesses. Breathing heavily, Max narrowed his eyes, his foot still suspended in mid-air. It had to be Dickie. Everything pointed to him, didn't it? It wasn't the first time they'd almost come to blows. Their businesses, or rather the proximity of the businesses, the main cause of their conflict. That and Dixon's big mouth that he had a nasty habit of running off at every available opportunity. "Ricky's right," Jamie added. "He didn't have a clue what you were talking about. It's not him." As he looked around the pub at the stunned faces staring back at him, Max placed his foot back on the floor and wiped his hand over his jaw. Smeared across his knuckles was Dickie's blood, and as the iron scent filled Max's nostrils, he hastily wiped the back of his hands down his blood-splattered jeans, in an attempt to rid himself of not only the sticky substance, but also the evidence of the brutal assault he'd carried out. Backing away slightly, he looked towards the bar staff. "No need to call in the old bill," he said in a warning, his menacing stare going back to patrons. "We're leaving." Outside in the car park, Max blew out his cheeks, the muscles across his shoulder blades still rigid, and as his breath streamed out ahead of him, he was barely conscious of the bitter cold wind that blew around them. He wanted to kick himself for wading in without getting his facts straight first. It was a rookie move, one that he'd warned Ricky and Jamie about time after time until he was blue in the face. Not that they ever listened to a word he said. That much was evident, considering the number of scraps they got into on a weekly basis. He turned his head to look back at the pub. Still the burning question remained. If it wasn't Dickie, then who else could have that much of a problem with him that they would resort to burning down the showroom? "So what do we do now, then?" Ricky asked, as he looked between his brother and Max. Met with silence, Ricky nudged Jamie in the ribs. Not only was his younger brother preoccupied with his phone yet again, but the sickening soppy grin plastered across Jamie's face was beginning to royally get right on Ricky's tits. "Are you actually with us tonight?" he barked out, as he craned his neck to get a better view of the phone screen in an attempt to see what it was his brother was so fascinated by. "What?" Looking up, Jamie ever so slightly leaned back before slipping the device into his pocket, out of his brother's view. Ricky narrowed his eyes, and giving Jamie a hard glare, he crossed his arms over his chest and shook his head. "What the fuck is with you lately? You're acting weird." Before they could start bickering like a couple of kids, Max held up his hand to quieten them down. "We go home," he sighed, beginning to wearily make his way to the car. "Yeah, but..." Ricky turned to look back at the pub. "What about Dixon? You did him over like a fucking kipper. That's not something you're going to be able to brush under the carpet. And you know as well as I do what he's like. He's got a big trap on him. And once he starts giving it all the mouth, this is going to cause us untold grief." Max sighed. He didn't need Ricky to tell him that his actions were going to bring him a shitload of trouble. He'd already worked that much out for himself. Not that Dickie Dixon or his sons were worth him losing any sleep over. "I need to think the situation through." In the circumstances, what else could he do? He had a nasty feeling that the real culprits weren't done with him yet. Not by a long chalk. The arson attack on the car lot was just the beginning, a taster of what was to come. He could feel it in his bones. "But what if they call in the old Bill?" Jamie asked. "There's bound to be CCTV. You'll be carted off to Nick again." "They won't," Max answered with an air of confidence. Jamie lifted his eyebrows, and giving a shake of his head, he caught his brother's eyes. "The boozer was packed solid. Someone's bound to open their trap. You know they are. Trust me, no one will call the filth." Unlocking the car, Max pulled open the door and took a seat behind the wheel, all the while keeping his gaze firmly focused on the entrance to the pub. They wouldn't fucking dare. Barry Dixon was the image of his father Dickie, the hook nose and premature greying hair more than a clear indicator that he was a Dixon. It would be fair to say that he wasn't a handsome man, not that this had ever held Barry back when it came to the ladies. His name alone was enough to guarantee that women fell at his feet, a fact that he had used to his advantage more than once over the years. As he and his younger brother Mark charged into the pub, a hushed silence fell over the bar, the patrons all keen to see how Dickie's offspring were going to react to the pounding he'd received. "Who did this?" On locating his father at the far end of the pub, spittle gathered at the corners of Barry's snarled lips, his hard stare boring into Dickie's skull. Dickie waved the question away. He'd always considered himself to be a tough man, and the fact Max Hardcastle had pretty much knocked him off his feet with one punch wasn't something he wanted broadcasted to the world. Not only was his pride severely dented, but his reputation was also hanging precariously in the balance. He'd underestimated Hardcastle, had wrongly assumed that the fact he himself was widely known as a hard fucker would have been enough to make Max retreat. The last thing he'd ever expected was for Max to actually lay into him. After all, word out on the street was that Max had gone soft, that after his second stint inside he'd come out a changed man. And even more than that, Dickie hadn't expected his legs to give way, nor subsequently find himself laid out on the floor, his nose pissing out blood and his jaw smarting from the right hooks he'd received. He took a sip of whiskey, making sure to keep his hand from shaking as he picked up the glass. "Dad," Dickie's youngest son Mark barked out, "answer the question! Who did this to you?" Holding up his hand, Dickie had never felt more ashamed. "It was nothing," he answered dismissively, his cheeks turning a bright shade of red. "Just drop it." "No, Dad," Mark hissed, as he looked his father over. His old man had always been a strong man, but looking at him now as he sipped at a whiskey, Mark couldn't help but notice how his father had seemingly aged overnight. The truth was, Dickie was no longer a spring chicken, his lined face a dead giveaway to the fact that he wasn't far off from collecting his free bus pass. Not that Dickie would actually be seen dead using public transport, especially seeing as his usual mode of transport was a jag. "Give me a name, Dad." Dickie looked up, a familiar craftiness settling in his eyes. He had been wronged after all. Why should Hardcastle get off scot-free for humiliating him in front of the entire boozer? "It was Max Hardcastle." He screwed up his face, the anger he felt clear for them all to see. "The bastard made a beeline for me the minute he walked through the door, and before I knew what was happening, he'd lamped me one." Making a point of touching his swollen jaw, Dickie dipped his head. "I just can't get me head around it," he cried. "There was me, minding my own business, looking forward to an evening out with me pals, and then bang!" He clenched his fist and mimicked throwing a punch. "The next thing I knew, I was on the deck, and the fucker was still swinging for me. I think the cunt got a couple of kicks in too. And as for the other two little bastards, the Tempests brothers, I think they landed one or two punches as well. How could I fight back? It was 3 against 1. He shifted his weight and grimaced as pain tore through his ribcage, all the while hoping that his little act was enough for his sons to believe he'd been outnumbered. "I should have known those muppets would be involved," Barry growled, sharing a knowing glance with his brother. "Well, don't you worry, Dad." Mark gripped his father by the shoulder, his voice loud enough for the entire pub to hear. "We'll make sure that they pay for this. No one whacks my old man and gets away with it." It took all of Dickie's effort not to smirk, and puffing his chest out with a sense of pride, he sipped at his drink. Of course his boys would take care of business. In all reality, he hadn't expected anything different from them. And good luck to Hardcastle and the Tempest brothers, because with his sons on the warpath, they were going to need all the luck they could get. Chapter 3. Early the next morning, Max wearily climbed out of bed. After tossing and turning through the night, he'd barely had a wink of sleep, and he had a sneaking suspicion that the only reason he was still able to function or think coherently was because of the adrenaline that ran through his veins. In the kitchen, he flicked the switch for the kettle to boil. Then, leaning against the granite worktop, he wearily looked down at his grazed knuckles, before closing his eyes and exhaling through his nose. He'd been so sure that Dixon had been the one responsible. Everything had pointed to him, hadn't it? Not that he could say he was sorry for the mistake he'd made. Dickie had been asking for a pounding for months, years even, and as far as Max was concerned, the beating had been warranted. His only mistake was taking his fist to Dickie in a public place. Instead, he should have dragged the bastard out of the pub, bundled him into the boot of the car and then driven him out to the woods, or somewhere else secluded, before laying into him. Once the kettle had reached boiling point, he heaped a large spoonful of coffee into a mug, added the hot water and a dash of milk, then took a seat at the chromed glass dining table. As he sipped on his coffee, he glanced in the direction of the bedroom where Tracey was sleeping. Despite them talking, or rather arguing, into the early hours of the morning, she was still angry with him. Not that he entirely blamed her. She had every right to be furious. He had lied to her, after all, or, as he liked to think of it, he hadn't exactly been truthful. Not that Tracey was able to differentiate between the two. As far as she was concerned, he'd been deceitful. And he had been, he supposed. Only in his defence, it was more of a little white lie, rather than some great big whopper of a story that he'd concocted. Regardless of its origins, though, it was still a lie nonetheless, one that he'd thought he would never be caught out on, and he wouldn't have been if the fire hadn't forced him to come clean and admit that some of the cars he sold weren't strictly legitimate. But at the end of the day, he'd never professed to being squeaky clean, and Tracey knew him well enough to know that he didn't hold down a 9-to-5 job. He was hardly going to stroll out of prison and find work in a bank, was he? No, he was better suited to robbing banks rather than sitting behind a desk counting out a customer's money. It was who he was. He couldn't change his mindset even if he wanted to. As for the car lot, the majority of the vehicles that passed through his hands would never even make it onto the forecourt. A few he would sell on to private buyers who knew exactly what they were buying, and the rest he sold to chop shops. In other words, the cars would be stripped down and the parts would then be sold on. It was a lucrative business, one that over the years had earned him a great deal of money. Wrapping his hands around the mug, he relaxed back on the chair. Over and over again he replayed the recorded message, and still he was no nearer to discovering the identity of the bastards who'd burnt down his business. Jamie was right. The recording was too muffled. The only sure thing he'd been able to determine was that the caller was definitely male, not that this fact was of any real help to him. For most of the night, Max had been racking his brain for a reason as to why he'd been targeted, and no matter which way he looked at the situation, nothing made sense to him. Why would someone want to destroy him? He may have been what was considered a face in the criminal underworld, and it would even be fair to say that he had a reputation that was highly warranted. But to his knowledge, he didn't have any active enemies, at least none that he was aware of, anyway. Well, perhaps there was one. His former pal, and he used that term loosely, seeing as he and Kenny Kempton had never been what he would call close mates to begin with. Even as kids, they'd had a turbulent relationship, and it was only because of Kenny's persistent goading that Max had finally snapped and battered to death the man his mother had lived with, the same man who had put his mother on the game and forced her to sell her body down at the docks. And Kenny certainly did have a motive, seeing as it had been Max, with the help of Tracey and her sons, who'd brought down the prostitution ring that Kenny, Terry Tempest and the Murphy family had been running. But even so, it was impossible. Kenny was banged up. How on earth would he have been able to orchestrate the arson attack from inside Belmarsh prison? It wasn't as though Kenny had many allies.